Hello, Honors 410, and happy Wednesday. Thank you all so much for participating in our first discussion thread from Monday. I think the discussion was really great from everything I've seen so far. And I appreciate the effort that they clearly went into making some really insightful comments, often beyond what I'd asked of you. I really appreciate the extra effort and lengths that so many of you went to. If you haven't participated yet in that discussion thread, depending on when this goes live and when you watch it, of course, you might still have a little bit of time to do that, but please make sure that you are tending to that. Or if you missed that first one, rest assured there'll be opportunities to kind of make up that ground. But you make sure you are staying tuned and are being an active participant in our discussions to follow. I'm not going to spend very much time in today's class talking about logistical matters or kind of course makeup, in part because I spent so much time doing that in the last lecture. But if you still have questions, please feel free to continue posting them here or messaging me privately. I know that, again, that this is a different kind of course for most of us, and so that there might be just kind of questions about how the course is operating or about the assignments or things along those lines. So please do feel free to still reach out or to post questions here if there are ones you think would be good for the whole class to see an answer to, and I'll continue to try to field those as those come up. And that includes if a question was already posed and I answered it, but you still don't fully understand what I was talking about. Some of that's to be understood as just kind of the nature of starting a new class, where you just experience it a little bit to fully get it. But there's also some pieces where I understand that it makes sense to me, but it might not make sense to anyone outside my headspace. So if you still have a question or confusion, it's likely as not that you're not the only one. Other people might have the same one. So please feel free to keep those coming. For today's lecture, though, I'm going to focus on the Justin St. Germain reading. This is a short essay that he published. I believe it's included in his new upcoming book. I think is going to be out. It's either later this year or early next year. I think some of the timeline may have been affected by our pandemic situation. But to give a little background context, some of which I imagine you gleaned from just reading this essay, and some of which you may have researched yourself a little bit. He's talking a lot about Truman Capote and his book In Cold Blood. And this is a really famous book. It was marketed and often described as a nonfiction novel, which is sort of an oxymoron, because basically nonfiction is what it sounds like. It's supposed to be a true story. The real definition of a novel is that it's a book-length fictional story, a narrative that stretches over a book's length. So basically it's saying this is a nonfiction piece of fiction. Right, so it's kind of an oxymoron, kind of a paradox. What that description is getting at is nonfiction writing up to that point had a tendency to really mostly just be informational. And this isn't to say this is the very first book that took a more narrative or storytelling kind of bent, but it was the first one kind of that reached kind of a mass audience, that had literary merit, that was primarily storytelling in the style of a novel, despite telling a nonfiction story. It sort of popularized that form, which now we kind of take for granted. This actually is not a very unusual type of book at all in 2020, but when it first came out was fairly distinctive for its time. And then the other book I want to make mention to from outside, although Saint Germain gets into it a number of times over the course of this essay, is Saint Germain's first book, Son of a Gun, where it's a memoir. It's a combination of sort of essays and kind of a larger overarching narrative, but it's all about the murder of his mother, but more broadly it gets into kind of concepts around domestic violence and around the kind of relationships that she was in, and around gun culture. And he kind of grew up in sort of a Wild West sort of setting in Arizona, and sort of how that shaped his own identity and how that shaped kind of the world at large. And it all kind of is a lens and kind of zooms in and out of his personal experience and what happened to his mother. So I think all of that's worthwhile context to have in mind when we start talking about the essay at hand. So as we get into it, though, the first thing I wanted to ask is a general question. It's not a trick question. I think it's covered largely in the essay, and it's something I think many of you probably have some concept of from outside the essay. But this concept of murder tourism that Saint Germain brings up, the title of this thing is Murder Tourism in Middle America. What is murder tourism? What sense do we make of that term? What do we think it might mean? What's our understanding from outside of this text? I'm just interested to hear what we all think of that term. Beyond that, in the first page here, in that I think it's the second paragraph here, there's a real emphasis on in Cold Blood happening almost the exact middle of America. And what's with that emphasis? Why does it matter that this is in the middle of America? Why put such emphasis on that term? What does that even mean? I think there's a literal geographic meaning, but what else might that represent about what this place represents about America, or what Saint Germain is kind of saying about this kind of story? I'm interested in what we might pull from that. Another major thread of this essay is the relationship between Saint Germain and Bonnie. He describes her as his co-pilot and de facto girlfriend, and he gets into some relatively intimate details of their relationship. This is a real person. So to my knowledge, this essay is entirely nonfiction. I'm sure that there are details that are fudged just for imperfections of memory and whatnot. But this is a non-fictional story. I can tell you with absolute certainty, I have met them both. Justin St. Germain and his wife now, spoiler, but they stay together, they get married. Bonnie Arning, she's a poet. The two of them are real people who are in the real beginning stages of a relationship as it's captured here. But so part of how he describes her here, he talks about her being up for anything, and that being something that makes her sort of intrinsically attractive, but also something that makes her keep her at arm's length. And I'm just curious what we make of that. I think we all come with kind of our own preconceptions around relationships and the kind of people we might be attracted to, or for lack of a better word, what's sexy. And we might not all agree on those things, but I think we get a fairly clear perception of sort of some of Saint Germain's taste, or some of what he's looking for, or maybe not looking for, right? Or what his better judgment says he shouldn't be looking for, but his instincts are nonetheless drawn toward here. But what sense we make of that idea that she's up for anything, and that's again attractive, but also why he wants to keep her at some sort of distance and not really commit to her at that point. Let's see, cutting ahead here on page 9, right after the section break that happens there. Let me scroll to it in my own PDF here. Okay, so they're talking about the point in getting it right in a version that no one reads. And so I'm curious what we can make of that, right? So he's talking about sort of this description of this house, this description of this barn, and sort of, again, he uses the descriptor of getting it right in the version no one reads. And so what does it matter getting it right in terms of the details that not everyone sees? What does he mean? Why would that matter? Why wait on what's documented or what's consumed? I think that there's some room for interpretation here. And again, I think it's telling about the way that Saint Germain is kind of processing the world, and specifically Capote's story and his own perceptions of murder and violence and so on and so forth. I want to cut ahead again to page 13 here. So this is the second to last paragraph. We'll scroll down a little bit here. So I'm just going to read this part aloud, and we can kind of see what we think of this here. I might not read the whole thing, but what we need to at least. So it starts, she hadn't read the book until the week before. I'd read it 5 or 6 times, growing angrier with each read, more outraged by its moral project, the glorification of a half-wit murderer, and its legacy, how it made us focusing on killers, the default mode of murder narratives, laid a cornerstone of murder worship in American culture. Now here I was, on a trip to Holcomb, reading to her my portrayal of a dead woman she would never meet, and it seemed absurd that I had never felt the weight of that before. A whole world of potential readers out there who would know my mother only from my book. So just to break this down a little bit, he's talking about the Capote book In Cold Blood, and how the focus is so much from the point of view of the murderers, and kind of understanding who they were, not necessarily trying to protect them or trying to redeem them, so much as get into their head and kind of depict what they were thinking, what they were doing. and Saint Germain is kind of objecting to this, right? And he has a very understandable perspective to be objecting to this, being someone who had his mother murdered, right? And now he talks about his own project that he's writing about his mother and about that experience and trying to put her in the foreground, but how kind of conflicting that is. And he gets into a little bit in the paragraphs to follow about is this sort of still kind of glorifying a kind of violence, or not so much, sending a message that kind of pays tribute to her, or that teaches us something about what to avoid or what to keep an eye out for, so much as it might be kind of just a sensational story that he's going to profit from, because he did make a significant sum of money from this book, right? So I'm curious, your reflections on all of that. If what you think of kind of this idea of glorifying a murderer, glorifying a victim, of whose story it even is to tell, right? I would reckon that Saint Germain has as much, if not more, of a right than anyone to tell the story of his mother and her having been murdered. But it's still not him, right? It didn't exactly happen to him. He was involved in it. But does he have the right to tell that story? Is it morally kind of conscionable to tell the story of his mother and kind of use that for his own gain? Because he seems to be grappling with that question in a pretty intensive way. I would suggest there's also some symbolism here in the way that the brake light is rendered directly following that. And we can assume it was real, but the author chooses what to focus on. So all the details that are scattered here, again, to my knowledge, everything is true. But Saint Germain, obviously, he didn't include every single thing that happened, right? There are some details too minute to possibly include. He chooses to reference this brake light. And it being out, and that being a reason they were held up. And I'm just sort of curious as why we think he chose that detail, what that might represent, and what he might be leaving out in the same vein. So that's also some food for thought. That's obviously a relatively quick scan through this essay. If we were meeting in person, it would be a little bit more of a give and take, where I would raise some of these questions and wait for your responses, and inevitably that would lead us to different tangents. And that's what I want to have happen in the online discussion as well. So please feel free to chime in the discussion thread. You can respond directly to the places I took us in the text and some of the questions I introduced, but also feel free to make it your own. Feel free to take it in other directions of things that stood out to you, or questions that you had while you were doing this reading. Maybe there's other moral questions that kind of came to your mind. But I think when we talk about, again, the literature of violence, kind of the focus of this course, this is all about this concept of, again, murder tourism on a literal level. And again, you feel free to weigh in on your reads of that. But also, I think, on a more metaphorical level, that Saint Germain, is obviously grappling with these ideas of his own mother's murder and writing about it. And then at the same time, visiting sites of these other murderers, or where the murderers lived and things like that. And I think it's a fascinating kind of cross-section there. And he's meditating a lot about what these acts of violence, what these acts of murder actually mean, how they should be represented. And I think a lot of the issues are kind of at the heart of what we're talking about in this course. And to be transparent, that's why I wanted to start with this essay. I think it's a well-written and compelling essay in any event, but I think it sort of raises, in some points directly and in some ways sort of subtly and sort of subversively, indirectly, these questions about how we perceive murder and what it means in our culture, what we choose to glorify and commemorate and remember, and what we don't, and all of these pieces. So, okay, I'm going to cut myself off there. So again, in general, I'm going to try to keep these videos to around 20 minutes or under, something closer to 15 minutes. If my clock is right here, we're under 14 minutes here, which is great, because my first video went much longer than I anticipated. So you get a little bit of a reprieve in today's video lecture. But thanks so much for watching and listening. And thanks again for already participating in the discussion thread for our first class, for the vast majority of you who have already done that. And I really look forward to seeing what you all have to say about this essay. And again, any questions or other points you'd all like to bring up. But otherwise, it's a 2-day-a-week class, so this is the Wednesday class. Have a great weekend, and I will catch you all again on Monday. Thanks, everyone.